Rob, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Yes, good. Thanks, Ed, and lovely to be here.
Good. So, by way of very brief introduction, Rob has been a senior executive in the newspaper world, rising from a junior sports journalist to executive managing editor at the Times and the Sunday Times. For the past decade, he's been intimately involved in the paper's drive towards digital future and has taken the lead management role in working with professional services teams with the law firms and Big Four. Rob, how would you describe your experience in the newspapers?
Well, Ed, a managing editor in newspapers tends not to get involved in the journalism so much, but handles all the other aspects of running the paper on the editor's behalf. I guess it's a bit like a chief operating officer in many respects. You're juggling lots of balls and you require the total trust of the person in charge. And that, for me, for more than 6 years as managing editor, focusing on the Sunday Times, has encompassed dealings with every business unit: commercial, marketing, BD, technology, facilities, procurement, finance, you name it, and of course the legal function, which has been of particular and increasing interest. Newspapers are fast moving, they're often a bit chaotic. You need to be thoroughly well organised, flexible, and pretty critically, innately calm to be successful in such a role.
Brilliant. Let's look at specific moments in your experience. You must have handled some supremely interesting situations during your time.
Yeah, what is it the Chinese proverb says about interesting times, Ed? I certainly lived through plenty of those, but I think I'd pick out maybe one of the serious moments, but really serious moments, was after the News of the World was shut in 2011, which many people will remember. And although that was nothing to do with either Times title in the first instance, there was a very real alarm at the parent company, particularly from the States, where the DOJ stepped in and threatened to investigate News Corp, which would have been thoroughly serious. On the back of the Leveson hearings and then the subsequent report, the company decided to bring in a rigorous compliance regime that would help to repair the damage that was caused by the phone hacking scandal, which, as many people remember, was considerable. So, working with the Chief Compliance Officer at News UK, I helped to devise, set up, and administer a tough compliance regime at the papers that we had to drive through in the face of pretty serious opposition and skepticism from the journalists. I particularly remember a conference call on which both editors were present, where the GC in New York, who had suitably gravel-voiced American tones, he underscored the gravity of the situation as seen from there, and it threatened the whole Murdoch edifice. In essence, we had to demonstrate clearly, unambiguously, that our house was in order in London, and few things later on to give me greater pleasure than when, largely off the back of how well we'd constructed this regime, the DOJ removed their threat of investigation. But it was hard work and required constant vigilance. Journalists are always trying to get some things past you.
Brilliant experience, though, and a great example of risk management and mitigation. You must also have handled projects involving change during your time.
Yeah, plenty. I mean, the newspaper industry has changed so much since I started in the mid 90s. I mean, the internet was still a very primitive beast and no one had heard of Amazon. But while an office relocation project gave me the chance to reshape the newsroom and how it functioned, sort of experience that is bizarrely become particularly relevant again now with future of offices on the agenda, and our technology project to replace the publishing systems. These were both enormous logistical exercises. But I would cite actually experience in overhauling our talent contracts as a big one, which took nearly a year, but proved really long lasting in value. And I worked closely in collaboration with the IP Council at the company, and we renegotiated all the talent contracts with contributors to the paper. And this included some of the genuinely big names attached to the titles, such as, say, Kaylee Moran on the Times, Jeremy Clarkson on the Sunday Times, to ensure that these contracts reflected up-to-date IP considerations and, critically, a more cohesive approach to the reuse of content, which is so important in the digital age. We took, to start with, a boilerplate type of contract, and we refined it continually after contributors made comments about it and we had our own experience to bring into it. And so within a couple of years, with the support of a young paralegal who's now become a brilliant associate at RPC, we could use a tool called Contract Express, which many people be familiar with, to automate the bulk of these contracts, and we reduced the time taken on them massively. I felt it was a really, really good example of fusing the sort of old school collaboration, people talking to each other, and negotiation with intuitive, intelligent software that allowed the legal function to focus properly on the value add rather than the boring but necessary. And it made me think really hard about how much more embedded tech could be in the legal department, freeing up resource to be more proactive and constantly reviewing or indeed originating documents that very often were basically the same as a previous one.
Yeah, fascinating, and a huge opportunity for the legal profession as well to adapt to an ever-changing scene. Let's talk about leadership in your career. I'm sure there's some interesting highlights there. Anything you'd like to reflect on?
Yeah, I when you think about this, some of the most awkward moments in the role, in fact, you really think about it, pretty much all of them center around employment matters, and in an industry which has been contracting for some years, newspapers dating to probably around the 2007-8 financial crisis, that tends to involve slimming the workforce. And when I started really focusing on the Sunday Times, there were good group of people who had been contributing to the paper for many, many years, but it was untenable financially for all of them to continue. We had to make cuts, bluntly, and I led that exercise, supported by our excellent employment council and, of course, the HR team. This required leadership, what I tend to call a less obvious kind. It's not the sort of stereotypical up and atom military fiction loves so much, but it's a sort of steely, compassionate, deeply respectful approach that delivers the change, which is uncomfortable, but without causing any more upset than is necessary. And it's about, to me anyway, clear communication and what I call employee empathy, and that's paramount. It still is a really proud thing for me to say that in my time, no employee relations cases went to litigation, and very few required external counsel getting involved, although those that did were instructive in terms of dealing with employment lawyers. One of them, I'll just give you an example, was sufficiently delicate for a whole bunch of reasons to require a little run through of how we're going to handle the conversation. We did that a couple of days previously, about 5 or 6 days, I think. And then somehow, and I've never found out how, Private Eye got to hear of this. And guess what? Their story appeared on the same day that we were going to have the conversation with this individual.
Coincidence.
Awkward. Despite that, we found some common ground in resolving the matter, and funnily enough, I remain on very good terms with that individual, notwithstanding it all. But in terms of taking a lead, one of the things that I've really, really enjoyed and something that gave me an enormous amount of pleasure was mentoring one of the corporate legal team at News at the then GC's request. It was pleasure for two reasons, really. One, because the GC had clearly identified that I had a rapport with, a sort of an understanding of, and respect for the lawyers under her control. But secondly, and more importantly, because the outcome went well. And obviously, I won't go into detail, but it was as much about helping this lawyer manage her way through a critical project that was really time sensitive, but also quite complex. And I know how much she benefited from the mentoring without blowing my own trumpet, and she's a very good friend still. And I've done other mentoring and coaching roles since, and I am so convinced that this is a vital part of the modern business armory when you do it well.
No, very interesting in it, and I think being able to forge strong professional relationships even in difficult times is absolutely key to any leader. So that's a really interesting reflection there. And you've managed to fit in a lot of work with the legal function at News and more widely. Taking that perspective and fitting it into the world of professional services more generally, what do you see as the big challenges for them?
This is a fascinating area, Ed. I mean, in some respects, professional services firms have a little bit been insulated from aspects of the disruption and the change that have swept through so many sectors. But I think the digital whirlwind that has upended newspapers so vigorously over the course of this century is going to swirl around professional services more fiercely now. I think what digital disruption has taught us above all is that it's the customer or the client who needs to be placed firmly at number one. No questions, no excuses. Look, for example, about how Jeff Bezos has worked tirelessly to get Amazon to do that. And I do ask myself quietly, when will Amazon try and muscle in on the provision of legal services? I bet it isn't long. Anyway, it's such a focus on the customer and the client, encompasses cost, time taken, ease of access, but especially now its provision of the service digitally. The pandemic has shown us that law firms can operate on a wide scale remote model. We're all doing it, but they can also do so without apparent dislocation to their finances. So many senior lawyers I've spoken to recently have expressed happy surprise at how their revenues have held up or even improved in some cases since the first lockdown last March. And while I expect offices to make a comeback and I expect firms still to operate out of them, many lawyers and accountants for that matter have realised that they can achieve a much more balanced but potentially equally well remunerated life by working remotely, at least for some of the time. I'm convinced that the opportunity for the sort of so-called new law firms is now huge. You've got Andrew Leatherland, formerly of DWF, setting up a distributed model firm that I suspect will gain serious traction. You've got Keystone Law, longer established, but adding to its firepower, and I'm sure plenty of others who are equally well placed. Money's going in from private equity elsewhere to legal tech as it drives innovation and change, whether independently of the bigger firms or from within. This will also place more of an emphasis on the talents, the skills of individual lawyers. And the very best I can see, they're already getting that they can practice in the same way to a certain extent that barristers have for generations. They use the new law firm as their set, in inverted commas, as a means for using some shared services, handling regulatory requirements, but being essentially self-employed and winning business through their reputation and their track record. And that ultimately could put the partnership model under strain. But I believe the model can respond. It needs to rethink plans for training, progression pyramid for lawyers, role of technology in the profession, and now the world of work in which we're working, whether remote, agile, whatever you want to describe it. But it's all driven fundamentally by the needs of who's paying for it. And this hasn't arguably always been so. But it remains, Ed, it's my really strong belief lawyers have a huge part to play in business generally. It's possibly easier in-house where the GC and their team can be fully engaged in helping the C-suite to deal with the slings and arrows of modern business, not least in managing and mitigating the risk component. But even in private practice, those lawyers who think more widely in their specific field can contribute materially to how the firm progresses and delivers for its clients. And I think it's still a monumentally exciting time to be involved with professional services because the firms and the entities that get this right will continue to be really, really successful. The requirement for strong legal and financial practitioners is as necessary and as vital and as critical as it ever has been.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a healthy balance there of opportunity and risk, and it's there for the taking, but it's a hugely competitive market, as you say, and I think ripe for innovative solutions with the clients at the fore. So that leads me on to the next question, Rob. What next for you? What's your plan?
Well, it's a very good question, Ed, and I suppose the easiest way to answer it is I've long wanted to have a bit of a change of focus in my career, and last year I stepped away from the newspapers. I've been doing a few consultancy projects since, but my aim now is to move full time into professional services with a view to bringing my digital knowledge in a field of disruption, change management expertise, storytelling capability, and other things besides, to bear here in equipping the progressive firms with the tools to thrive in the post-COVID world. Managing people will be essential and pivotal to doing this. Human capital still remains the greatest asset that pretty much any working entity has. And we've all had plenty of opportunity, haven't we? Not least because there's been nothing else to do, to think about what we're doing, why we're doing it over this past really difficult year. And that's where I'd love to go, and I'm more than ready to grapple with it.
Brilliant. Rob, great insight there. Thanks very much for sharing your thoughts, and speak soon.
Thanks, Ed. It's been a pleasure.